So just to refresh your minds, last week we looked at the first two verses, and we just touched on verse 3, and we saw that in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, and the Word created all things. And as I mentioned that for many years, and I think there are still large numbers of Christian scholars who look at a very Greek understanding of that word, which is the Greek word logos. I was even reading a very renowned scholar's commentary this week, and he's all about this divine principle that permeates the universe, and he seems to think that that's the understanding. But if we read John's gospel, we find that it's a very Jewish gospel. There are so many references to the Old Testament, clear references and prophecies and even allusions, which are clear references, but when you read the words, it should conjure up in your mind something from the Old Testament. And so John is writing a very Jewish gospel, and he's using Jewish words. And the word that he uses, the word, is, as I firmly believe, comes from the Old Testament understanding of the word, because in the Old Testament we see again and again God appearing in human form to the people of Israel through his speech, through his actions, through visions, through the pillar of fire, the pillar of cloud, through the angel of the Lord, through many other what we call theophanies or Christophanies. He appears in the Old Testament, and the Jewish scholars who translated the Old Testament into Aramaic after the exile in Babylon, because during the exile in Babylon, most of the people of Israel started speaking Aramaic. And so they translated the scriptures from Hebrew into Aramaic. And that gave rise to what we call the Targums. Targums are simply translations from Hebrew to Aramaic. And we call them the Aramaic Targums. And what they've struggled with is where they find very human descriptions of God in the Old Testament. And they don't know what to do with it, because there can't be two gods. And so the way that they solve this problem is to talk about something they call the memra of Yahweh, the word of the Lord. The memra is just an Aramaic word for word. And the word of the Lord is there with God, acting as an agent of God. It's interesting that when we read the story of creation and we get to the end of creation in Genesis 2 verse 3, and it says there that God rested at the end of all the work of creating he had done. God rested. Now, this is a problem for the Jewish translators, because does God rest? Does he need to take an afternoon nap? Does he get tired? Does he slumber? Does he sleep? Does he rest? No, the Bible says no. But here it says that God rested. So in the Targums, and this one specific Targum, you don't have to worry about it. It's called Targum Neofiti, and it says the memra of the Lord. The memra of the Lord rested. It says, on the seventh day, the memra, or the word of the Lord, completed his work which he had created, and there was Sabbath. Sabbath is just the word for rest. So it's very interesting that they see there's a problem there. For us, it's not a problem, because we know who he is. You know who the word of the Lord is. The word of the Lord is Christ. So for the Christian, this is wonderful news. It's not a problem. And so John, the Apostle John, grabs hold of this very Jewish understanding of the word of the Lord, or the memra of Yahweh, and he tells the people to whom he writes this gospel, this is whom I'm talking about. When you read the Aramaic scriptures, the Hebrew that's been translated into Aramaic, and you see these very human-like appearances, what it seems to be of God, You know it's the word of the Lord, and that's the person I'm proclaiming to you. And he says this person, this word of the Lord was with God. He was God, so there are not two gods. He was God, and the word created all things. And then he carries on here from verses 4 onwards, and he brings in a new concept. And he says, in him was light. In him was life, and the life was the light of men. So we're going to look at that. And as John starts revealing deeper truths about the word. And like I said, the first 18 verses of John's gospel is just an introduction. We call it the prologue. He comes back to these ideas again later in the gospel and expands them and develops them and explains them. And so here he's talking about the light, and the first thing I want to mention here is that the source. What is the source? Who is the source of life, of light? And in verse 4 and verse 5 we see what the source is. He says, in him. In whom? In the Word. In this person called the Word, there is life. And that life was the light of men, to shine light into the darkness. In verse 5 he says, the light shines in the darkness, but the darkness has not overcome it. Now once again, this is a sentence in English that you may just read over and say, well, he's talking about light, which we haven't got a lot of in South Africa today, because we've got Eskom, but that's not that kind of light that he's talking about. He's talking about a very, very well-known concept from the Old Testament. Who can tell me where this idea of light comes from? It comes from the Exodus. It comes from the Exodus because it was during the Exodus that God moved the people of Israel out of Egypt, and he went ahead of them during the night in a pillar of fire. And during the day, he was above them in a pillar of cloud. So it was a pillar of cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night. And they saw this light. And when the Egyptians pursued them up to the Red Sea, it says that God showed darkness to the side of the Egyptians. The cloud was on the side of the Egyptians, but on the side of the Israelites, there was light. And so this is a very, very Jewish, a very Hebrew idea. In Exodus 13 verse 21 we read, by day Yahweh went ahead of them in a pillar of cloud to guide them on their way, and by night in a pillar of fire to give them light, so that they could travel by day or by night. And I think they did a lot of traveling by night. Why? Because it's desert and it's hot. It's hot. It's like in Qatar where they're playing soccer, but there they have air conditioning in the stadiums, but there was no air conditioning, so they had to travel by night. And it says there with the Red Sea episode, throughout the night the cloud brought darkness to the one side, to the Egyptian side, and light to the other side. And then we also read, the interesting thing is that the Lord looked down during the last watch of the night on the Egyptians, and he threw the Egyptian army into confusion. And this is the idea that John is trying to explain to us. He says the darkness, the Egyptians couldn't overcome the light, which is the light of Yahweh. And he says when he writes these two verses, for us it may not mean much, but for the Hebrew, for the Jew, this is full of significance. Yes, the darkness, the light shines in the darkness. The darkness cannot overcome it, but the light will prevail. And then we understand that the light led them throughout the wilderness. And as we go through the Old Testament, it's a brief, just a scanning of the Old Testament history. We read again of a period of great darkness and oppression during the time of the wicked kings of Israel and Judah. There was a time of great darkness, and there were wicked kings like Ahaz. And Ahaz rejected the guidance and the protection of the Lord, and he sought refuge from from the kings around him, from the kings of the northern kingdom of Israel and the kings of Syria, to protect them against the rising Assyrian threat of his day. And there was a time of great darkness because he was a wicked king. And then the Assyrians were coming, and they would eventually destroy Syria, destroy the northern kingdom, and take all the northern people of Israel into exile. And it's during this time that Isaiah comes and he writes the following, a well-known passage from the Old Testament, Isaiah 9. He says, the people who walk in darkness will see a great light. For those who live in a dark land, the light will shine on them. How does Isaiah explain this? How will this happen? For unto us a child will be born, a son will be given to us, and the government will rest on his shoulders, and his name will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Eternal Father, Prince of Peace. So all of this is in the back of the people of Israel's mind. And then when Jesus comes on the scene as a man, during the incarnation, it's again a time of great darkness. Darkness because of the religious leaders, which the prophets tell us about. The religious leaders, they are bad. They are leading the people of Israel astray. They are wicked. And added to that, apart from the spiritual oppression, there's the oppression of the Roman Empire. And it's during this time that the prophecy of Isaiah, that the light would come, takes place. Now, the average person in the street would not recognize Jesus. I mean, he lived in a small backwater called Nazareth, and he worked in his father's carpenter shop, if we can believe tradition. And so there he was, hidden away. And at a certain stage, when he was 30 years old, he went to the Jordan, and there was a man called John the Baptist. And this is the next figure in John the Apostle's gospel, the witness to the light. In verse 6, he says, there came a man who was sent from God, and his name was John. That's not John the Apostle who's writing the gospel, that's John the Baptist. And he came as a witness to testify concerning that light, so that through him all men might believe. He himself was not the light, he came only as a witness to the light. And so the Apostle John writes, and he tells us there's this man called John. We call him John the Baptist. And he came as a witness to point us to the light. Because without his ministry, without his work, we couldn't recognize the light. We wouldn't know whom God referred to in the Old Testament. And we find in the Old Testament, once again, many prophecies speaking about John the Baptist and the one coming after him. And the most famous one is in Isaiah 40. All four of the gospel writers use Isaiah 40 to explain that there will be a witness, somebody would announce the light, somebody would be preparing the way for the coming one, and the question we must ask is, who is the coming one? And we read in Isaiah 40 verse 3, we read about a voice of one calling. And again he uses Exodus language, the language of the Exodus, of the wilderness wanderings. He says, in the wilderness, prepare the way for Yahweh. We miss this in English. You know that we miss this in English. We read it in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and we miss this. The voice will prepare the way for someone called Yahweh. That's what it says. Make straight in the wilderness a highway for our God. That's the one who's coming. And then in verse 5 he says, and the glory of Yahweh will be revealed, and all of mankind will see it. And then he goes on and he says, you bring good tidings to Zion. Zion is the idea of a city, a spiritual city, a glorious city in which God will dwell. And only the redeemed will be there. And he says, you bring good tidings to Zion. Go up on a high mountain. You bring good tidings to Jerusalem. Lift up your voice with a shout. Lift it up. Do not be afraid, and say to the towns of Judah, here is your God. Here is your God. That's what John is doing. And that's why John the Baptist is so important. Because he's the last Old Testament style prophet that would come. And he is the one that would mark the coming of the Anointed One, the Messiah, the Son of God. He's the one who points the way. And he says, prepare the way for the Lord, and his glory shall be revealed. And he will say, here is your God. And like I said, we don't see that always so clearly in the New Testament, because we don't always take the effort to say, well, John, Luke, Mark, and Matthew are quoting this passage. Let me turn back to the Old Testament and see what is there. That's the idea, is that we should go back and see what is there. The prophet Malachi says the same thing. He says there that you have wearied Yahweh with your words and with your actions, and then they react. It's like a diatribe. They're talking to God. It's the prophet Malachi is speaking for God, and it's like the nation is answering, and they say, how have we wearied Yahweh? How have we wearied God? And he says, you say, everyone who does evil is good. Why? Because nothing happens to them. You can live a wicked life and nothing happens to you. And you say, where is the God of justice? And here comes the answer. He says, behold, I will send my messenger, and he will clear the way before me. And the Lord whom you seek, you say, where's the God of justice? The Lord whom you seek will suddenly come to his temple. And behold, he is coming, says the Lord of hosts. So he says exactly the same thing as what Isaiah says. And that is why when the Pharisees and the teachers of the law asked Jesus, they challenged Jesus, say, by what authority are you doing these things? You know what Jesus' answer was? He said, I'll ask you a question. And if you answer me this question, I'll tell you by what authority I'm doing this. And what's the question? Who's John the Baptist? Is he from man or is he from God? Is he a prophet or is he not? And they knew that the people of Judah would know that John is a prophet that has come from God. And they knew that they couldn't say that he's not, because then they would lose their popularity. And so what did they say? We don't know. We don't know. They can't say he's from God, because if they say he's from God, then Jesus must be the one. He must be the one that Isaiah and Malachi and other prophets spoke about, and that they couldn't say. If they say he was from man, they would fall into disrepute and become unpopular. So they said, we don't know. And then Jesus says, well, I don't know either. I'm not going to tell you by what authority I'm doing these things. And that is why John the Baptist is so important, so that nations will recognize the light. Which leads us to the third point, the recognition. It says in verse 9, the true light that gives light to every man was coming into the world. He was in the world, and though the world was made through him, they did not recognize him. Here's Jesus, and he's walking around on earth. And he's not here today, but we have this book. We have the New Testament, and we have the Old Testament. And this book is known, it's the most well-known book in all the world. Do you know that? It's the most well-known book in all the world, translated in the most languages of any book in the world. And people read this and they hear about Jesus. And they can't even say they haven't heard about him, because it's on YouTube, it's on television, it's on on the internet. And if you sit somewhere in Timbuktu or somewhere and you wonder, I'm living in a Muslim community, who's this Jesus? And you just type in Google, Prophet Google, say, Jesus, who is he? And then there will be an answer. And you can read it. But in Jesus' day, when he was on earth, what did he do? He walked on the earth, lived amongst the people of Judah for 3 years, and he did many, many miracles, confirming from the Old Testament that he was the one that the voice of Isaiah pointed to. He was the one. And then at the climax almost of his ministry before his crucifixion, what did he do? He went to the Feast of Tabernacles. And you know what the Feast of Tabernacles is all about? It's commemorating that time when God lived with Israel back in the Old Testament in the wilderness in his own tent, as it were. Not that God lives in a tent, but there was a tent called the tabernacle. And in that tabernacle, the glory of the Lord, whenever they set it down after a day's march or a week's march, or whenever they set it down, the glory of the Lord would come down and descend on the tabernacle and reside in the tabernacle in a visible form. And whenever they had to move out again, the Bible tells us when they picked up the tabernacle and all the trimmings and all the things associated with it, and they started moving, the glory of the Lord would ascend from the tabernacle and go ahead of them in a pillar of fire and in a cloud. And that was what they were commemorating, the Feast of Tabernacles, the most popular Jewish feast, one of the great 3 feasts that they have every year: Pentecost, Passover, and Tabernacles. And during the Feast of Tabernacles, people all over Jerusalem, people come from all over the world, Jews, and they come to Jerusalem and they make little booths, little tents, little booths with twigs and leaves, and they live in these booths for a week, for 8 days. And every day there is a water ceremony and a light ceremony. The last, greatest day of the feast, there is a light ceremony when they light 4 huge candles in the temple. You know why they do that? They recognize that God lived with them in the wilderness, and they say, by commemorating this, we do this light ceremony so that people will remember this time when God lived with us. And it's during this feast, and the last and the greatest day of the feast, that Jesus did something. You know what he did? He, first of all, there were 2 ceremonies, like I said, the water ceremony and the light ceremony. And the first thing that Jesus did, he stood up in the temple and he shouted, I am the one that can give the water of life. And if you drink of this water, you will never, ever, ever thirst again. In fact, these streams of water will well up inside of you and overflow into the world around you. And then he waited a bit for the commotion to die down. And what was the next thing he shouted? I am the light of the world. And he who follows me will never live in darkness, but will have the light of life. And that's why he did that. And this he did at the Feast of Tabernacles. And then, just to make it without any confusion, so that everybody could recognize this, John says in verse 14 of chapter 1, the Word became flesh, and he tabernacled among us. He pitched his tent among us. The word there in Greek is actually the word skyneo, which means to pitch your tent. Like when you're going camping, you pitch your tent. And Jesus came to this world and he pitched his tent among us. He tabernacled among us, and we have seen his glory. And once again, this is not a new idea. It's already there in the Old Testament. Psalm 34, one of my favorite psalms, says, you know what it says? The angel of the Lord, the messenger of Yahweh, he pitches his tent near the believer. He pitches his tent near the believer. My friends, this is all information. This is all wonderful fulfillment of prophecy. And maybe you say, wow, I never heard this before. Maybe I wonder what's for lunch. I wish this guy would stop. But my friend, the most important question of all, and this is what John wants you to know. Have you seen the light? Have you seen the light? Have you seen the light? Have you accepted the light? And I want to conclude with that, the acceptance. It says the true light that gives light to everyone who does believe is coming into the world. He not only gives light, he is the light, and you need to recognize and accept him. Otherwise, this is just a story. You need to recognize and accept him. And Jesus says in the Sermon on the Mount to the disciples, you are, or you will be, the light of the world. If you become the disciple of Jesus, you are the light of the world. Because you carry the light within you and you take it to the world. Not light like a divine spark or a new age idea, but the light of Christ. You carry it in you. And the world does not recognize that. He says there in verses 9 and 10, he was in the world, and though the world was made through him, the world did not recognize him. John loves this use of the word world, this idea of the world. It doesn't mean this planet we are living on. He means those who are opposed to God. In his first letter he writes in 1 John 2 verse 15, he says, do not love the world or anything in the world, for if anyone loves the world, the love of the Father is not in him. For everything in the world, the cravings of sinful man, the lust of his eyes, and the boasting of what he has and does comes not from the Father, but from the world. The world and its desires passed away, but the man who does the will of God lives forever. So that's the world. And we must not be part of that. The thinking of the world, the principles of this world. We need to accept that Jesus is the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The Word created all things. The Word is the light that gives life to us, and we must believe in the light. And my friends, that is the message, or part of the message of 1 John 1 or John 1 verse 4 to 10. And I want you, please, dear friends, to think about this, because this may be the last chance that you may have. You may not be here tomorrow. So please think of that. And for those who believe in the Son of God, we are told by the same John, who is it that overcomes the world? Remember, he said the darkness cannot overcome the light. Who is it that overcomes the world, everything against God? Only he who believes that Jesus is the Son of God. He is the one that overcomes. Amen.